Hey, and welcome back to the MBT podcast. Thank you for joining me on this episode 3, where we will be talking about unlocking true, I want to say trunk stability. I don't really want to call it core, but we'll get there here in a bit. The main focus here is talking about trunk stability, how to create rigidity, how to utilize the system if, in regards to the kinetic chain and how it applies in everything you do in life from sport to posture. But that's pretty much the summary of this episode here. I want to introduce myself. My name's Sheldon. I've been in the sports medicine industry for a little over 5 years. I've been in the health, wellness, fitness industry for a little over 2 decades now. And I just want to utilize this platform to share my experience, my perspective, my outlook. We can tie into a little philosophy, but I want to try to keep it on track here with the whole idea of this being a sports medicine podcast. And sports medicine podcast, yes, there are many out there, but at the same time, this is one perspective of many. And the thing that gravitates community is the likeness, the ability to relate. And I just hope to inspire the up and coming generation and share insights and experience. And maybe this is something that you connect with, whether you're a practitioner or if you're seeking to develop, this is just the place to be. So thank you for joining me. Again, my name's Sheldon, and I look forward to getting into this episode with you all. So we're going to start off here with the first segment where we talk about what is trunk stability, right? And the other question that might you say trunk, what do you mean by trunk? But if I say something like explain core stability, there is a little bit more of a societal acceptance to the whole word core versus trunk. And I get it, but I'm not here to appease the masses. I'm here to just follow what the science says, follow the theory, follow the concepts, the principles, understand and respect things like tissue healing phases, and be open-minded to progressive treatments and being up to date when it comes to healthcare technology and the ability to live lengthen lifespan and longevity and resiliency and these characteristics when it comes to not just what you do for a career, but what you do in everyday life, because life is movement. Life movement doesn't just end when you're thinking about your posture, because maybe you have to pay more attention to how you lift things because you're a manual labor type of person in your field of work, or maybe you just use your body in general. And that's the thing, is it never turns off, right? It's not like you go home and turn into a sack of potatoes on the couch and zone out, right? Hey, look, we're always thinking about it from a longevity standpoint, whether it's how you recover, whether it's active recovery, days off. The things you do accumulate and they don't have to be a whole lot. And it can be a little and it can be a slow burn in that sort of way where you just practice at it, you chip away at it, you continue to refine, to hone, to sharpen the sword, to become better at it. It's what gets you up in the morning. It's the reason that gives you purpose and fulfillment and meaningfulness. And we all need that in our own lives, in our own ways, in different ways, shapes, and forms. And that's the personal journey, right? But I digress. So I want to stay on the topic of what is trunk stability here. And we got to understand that it's beyond, again, this goes back to societal acceptance, societal norms. What is aesthetically pleasing isn't necessarily what's going to be functional, right? Because when we think about core, most people think about the rectus abdominis, the six pack, right? And sure, but that is one player in the big ocean of trunk and circumferential stability that we have to create, right? When you think about six pack, it's the things that bring everything together. Sure, it's like the suture to the wound, it holds it together, but it's not the end all be all, because you have systems and components that are comprised of the bigger picture, which is the cylinder of our torso, right? From front all the way around to the back. That is your internal and external obliques. Those are going to help with rotational forces and absorption, right? More connected more into the fascial system and the whole kinetic chain entirely, where Think about internal or external obliques. You look a level up, you're looking at your lat. You look a level down, you're looking into your adductor, and then you're going into your lower leg and plantar fascia. And this is the entire oblique sling. So internal and external obliques are key players when it comes to integrating the system together. And then you have your transverse abdominis. If it wasn't for anything, it would be the transverse abdominis would be like the stone of it all, because the transverse abdominis is that circumferential stabilizer that helps us expand and load against compressive forces, against rotational forces. It's what helps us create rotational force in essence, is the transverse abdominis, because it is the sling of entirety that connects basically the trunk as a system, right? Without the transverse abdominis, we would not be able to absorb compressive forces as efficiently, because it holds everything together in that sort of way. So transverse abdominis is basically, if you think about wearing a corset, if you had a corset on, this is that. The corset wraps everything together. So it basically integrates the rectus abdominis to your paraspinals and your thoracolumbar fascia. And this is one entire stretch of tissue that connects and binds, and it helps us. Again, the key thing here is rotation and absorption of compressive forces, which is essentially, if you think about it, if we didn't have that, what would that be? Engineers out there, this is essentially, this is what shearing is, right? So shear is rotational as well as compression. Rotational compression create a shearing force. When you think about the trunk as a system, whether you think about a muscular strain, right? We have rotational shearing type forces that can be placed upon a muscle that can induce a tearing sort of effect or a rupturing sort of effect, depending on the severity, right? But in severity, we also have different types, different grades, which we could talk about in another episode. But this is essentially talking about the trunk. So transverse abdominis is, again, one key player, the big key player that keeps everything together. And then we have our paraspinals, right? Good acronym here for you studying folk out there. If you remember, I love spaghetti, those are your three paraspinal muscles that hold you up, right? So for you to hold that upright posture, it would not be for without these muscles that we wouldn't be able to upright. So I love spaghetti, iliocostalis, longissimus, and semispinalis. Those are your three spinal erectors or paraspinal muscles, right? So those big slabs along the side of your spine, you have one on each side. That's what those are. So those are key players as well too, and we have to understand that we also have deep internal muscles where we can segmentally flex and extend our spine. So it's not like the paraspinals are the only thing holding us up. We have things like the multifidi, right? And those types of muscles can also create segmental motion on the spine itself. So we have to understand the vital importance that it's not just our rectus abdominis when it comes to core. There's so much more to it. We have our deep stabilizing system, right? Which is going to be basically your diaphragm, your pelvic floor, and your multifidi. If it were not for these three muscles, we would not be able to create internal pressurization against our cylinder, our external wall, right? So it's an internal pressure push out against an external wall, which is our trunk, right? And how well we can absorb that is heavily dictative, or is going to heavily dictate injury prevention and injury reduction, right? Because if we think about, again, the topic of resiliency, if we think about what a herniation is, an umbilical herniation, it's a protuberation of your intestines breaking through your abdominal wall. Why is that? You can have those really elite athletes that even have sports hernias because they're creating so much internal pressure that they have to have a strengthened external wall to be able to absorb that. Otherwise, that's where you have penetration of the intestines through abdominal wall. And in the even just sedentary individual, this becomes more of an inherent risk because gravity is a constant. So we're always absorbing compressive forces, whether we're supine, whether we're prone, whether we're verticalized. We're always going to be absorbing some compressive force by the earth itself, by Earth's gravity. So that is going to be a constant. So we have to be mindful, and even if we're not active, that we have to be able to build resiliency upon loading our body daily so that we can at least withstand literally the weight of the world as you transport yourself throughout this world. So when we talk about things like posture is essentially optimized. We can call it posture. We can call it sport performance. Well, we can call it posture is essentially a character type of anything that we do in life, whether it's sports performance, whether it's ergonomics, whether it's moving something, whether it's doing a job task, anything you do in life, even parenting. There's a posture when you parent, when you're holding your child. There's ergonomics when it comes to holding your child. Ways our body compensates itself by standing offset. And we have to be mindful and aware of this because this is essentially how we have increased or optimal wear and tear because there's always going to be, again, that compressive force. So if we're standing, more compressive force on the joints, right? We think about ankle, we think about knee, we think about hips, we think about spine, absorbing the compressive forces of gravity. So we have to be mindful of that. And if we're supine, of course, there's going to be basically no gravity placed upon us because supine, wider surface area. When we're laying supine, there is a compressive force of gravity on us still, sure. It's less riskier than if you were verticalized. But at the same time, you can't expect yourself to be supine for the remainder of your life because that's how. Well, this could be a reason why you end up in bed rest is because you're sedentary, right? Sedentarism is a symptom of poor physical activity, right? Or would be an attribute of poor physical activity. And we can understand that entirely just based off that logical premise. So now that we've talked about posture and how that is definitely a main characteristic when it comes to whatever we do, we also have to understand, based off of this whole framework, common misconceptions when it comes to training your trunk. When it comes to training trunk, we have to understand that it's more than just sagittal range of motion, right? Most people love to do the crunches, they love to do six pack type workouts, which that is one component, right? That's great for resiliency in terms of, again, being able to absorb the internal pressurization of the diaphragm against the external wall. So, if we talk about examples of exercises now, or training, or rehab, whatever stage you're at, there's always going to be a factor of diaphragmatic intra-abdominal pressure. And essentially, the intra-abdominal pressure is utilization of the diaphragm against the external abdominal wall. That's essentially going to be the foundation that you set upon when it comes to anything trunk training. Yes, we can do things like typical six pack crunches. We can also do things like leg raises. I don't really advise doing things like scissors kicks in a supine position without adequate trunk stabilization. And most people end up going into what is known as an open scissors posture where they have their rib cage flared up. They're in a deep anterior pelvic tilt. And by doing that, they're creating unfavorable amounts of pressure due to the posterior compressive forces of the spine, right? So basically, if you look at your spine, you have a bone and then you have a disc in between, and you have that for all the layers of the spine. And basically, in between the bones of the spine, the disc is, you can think of it like a jelly donut, right? So the center is a very jelly like substance, very viscous, it's very hydrated, right? So this is part of, from a longevity standpoint, we need to make sure we're staying hydrated because the discs do absorb water as well as the remainder of our body, right? So we have to have a minimum level of hydration for at least discal longevity. But the center of the disc is what's known as the nucleus propulsus, right? And it's a jelly-like substance. And then on the external, the outside of that jelly donut, you have what's known as the annular fibrosis. These are thick, cartilaginous annular fibers, very resilient to compressive forces, especially as we're younger. When we're younger, though, right, we're more hydrated, we're taking care of our body, we're doing things to keep us physically active, right? Some people continue that into college. Some people continue that into recreation. Some people, and this was perspective insight. This is something I was thinking about recently was some people don't ever get that. And it's completely unfortunate because physical activity is definitely a key indicator to longevity and resiliency and being able to just have a strong body throughout life. So sure, you can go on YouTube and find all these different types of trunk exercises, things like anti-rotation press outs, things like intra-abdominal pressurization. Some people refer to this as Valsalva. That is one form, but we also have to respect the concepts of it. We can't just say, hunker down. Yep, you're doing it. There's more to it than that. We have to make sure that it's done right, because it's easy with this sort of thing to look like you're doing something, but internally we're not creating pressure, or we're being passive with some structures that are also having to be active. So we got to be mindful of the principles of the cueing to ensure quality of motion, because again, it's running. Repetitive micro trauma on the joints over a prolonged period of time. The key thing here is exposure and dosage. And that is essentially physical training in essence. Is it's modulating the volume, intensity, the dosage, ensuring that optimal rest and recovery are occurring, ensuring that you're being mindful of goals of the individual and the reason behind their why, but also subtly integrating that in a way that is fostering a lifestyle versus a check off the list type of objective. And such is that sort of mindset when it comes to things like nutrition. I've had these conversations with many people, and every time I have this conversation, it goes something along the lines of, oh, what diet are you on? Oh, how much weight are you trying to lose? So it's very goal driven. Yes, I'm on the keto diet because I'm trying to lose 10 pounds. Well, what's going to happen after you lose the 10 pounds? Well, I don't know. I'll probably just continue eating what I enjoy. Well, don't you think that that's not really like a lifestyle then? It's just sort of something to get to check the box. Why not, from a longevity standpoint, think of it as this is something that I enjoy, and I understand what I can do in moderation, and I can basically live my life without having to sacrifice anything, because this is what I would be doing anyway, right? And that's not to say that, hey, well, that you could just be very gluttonous and frivolous with the nutrition. That's not what I'm saying at all. You could just keep it as simple as macros. And that is probably the most simplest way to look at it. But for most people, that is a significant start. Just being able to understand moderation, what is too much, what is not enough, and creating more awareness to how your body's feeling, right? And again, this is a very simplistic way to think about it. If there's more of a goal at stake, right? Whether it's a competitive athlete, whether it's someone who is having to be doing a very laborious type of work, we also have to make sure that we're fueling our body right so that we can do what we're requiring it of it. That's essentially what resiliency is building longevity, durability, being able to bounce back when something happens, whether it's sickness or whether it's injury or whether it's something that we're going through physically, could be mentally as well, right? Because we know that is going to be a stressor on our life, and stress is going to affect our recovery and how we rest. So we have to be mindful of a more holistic approach when it comes to our goals and what we're demanding of our body. So now that we got an understanding of these concepts of what our trunk versus our core or our six pack is, we can move a little bit deeper here and talk about how it applies in everyday life, whether it's athletics, whether it's labor intensive, whether it's everyday life. And the only real difference is the level of which we require or the demand that we impose on our body, whether it's physical training for preparedness or whether it's for sport, right? And in sport, we can have more reps, essentially, it's more volume. But at the same time, if you're an assassin or whatever, I'm sure that's a pretty high level activity where you have to be prepared as well. So we have to respect resiliency and recoverability from that standpoint, because it's a long game sort of thing. But at the same time, we're going to be required to rotate. We're going to be required to flex and extend. We're going to be required to reach, to get in awkward postures, right? To get in less than ideal situations under less ideal circumstances, having to move. So we should use movement as the structure to the foundation, because when it comes to something like movement, when it comes to things like posture, that is going to be a main attribute and characteristic of nearly anything that we do physically. So if we don't have sufficient trunk and internal pressurization, stability and rigidity, we can run into physical manifestations of these issues, whether it be low back pain, whether it be vestibular system, because now we're essentially having an unstable trunk, which is now not able to transmit forces from the upper extremity and lower extremity. That means that we're going to have coordination issues. We're going to have stabilization issues. And this is going to be an increased risk to injury when we commute about the world. So we got to be mindful of these. And when it does come to the issues of things like low back pain, there are definitely reductive type of movements you can do, definitely depending on the situation, that can alleviate or completely resolve symptoms. But again, it is a continuum. We have to maintain a level of readiness we require of our bodies. That has to at least be the minimum, right? But to maintain a base level of functional preparedness, we have to have things like cardiovascular fitness. We have to have things like resistance, being able to resist, absorb, transmit forces, right? And we have to be efficient from a longevity standpoint, right? Efficient in how we move, because if we're moving in compensatory patterns, right, we're creating non-ideal movement strategies. We're creating uneven wear and tear on structures. We're creating movement inefficiencies and increased neural load, right? And there was an interesting study that found that, I believe it was a collegiate level soccer, two collegiate level soccer athletes. They were on the same team. One had an ACL, and they did functional brain scans and found that the athlete, after I believe 9 months of recovery, where there was significantly more brain activity versus the non-surgical athlete. And you think, well, that's good, right? Good, more brain activity is good. Well, not necessarily, because they're doing the same activity, right? But one is more efficient, which means that it requires less neural load, which means that it's able to utilize that memory allocation for either more advanced tasks or other tasks, right? And that's essentially what efficiency is, right? So with the post-surgical athlete, the reason being is that there are still movement patterns, there are still neuromuscular as well as synaptic pathways that have to be reconstructed. And this takes a specific level of time. Now, of course, the athlete isn't starting as a baby, right? But developmentally, there are going to be steps back that happen that we have to still be able to master as a prerequisite to our movement strategy. So, simple exercises that we can just begin with would be things like intra-abdominal pressurization or diaphragmatic breathing. And depending on the level that we're at, we can make it more complex or we can make it very simple in a simple supine supported 3-month position, right? So that is essentially where I would start, depending on the level of athleticism or the level of ability of the individual. I would progress it. You can go to a 6-month, you can go to unsupported, you can go to verticalization, you can go to undifferentiated patterns, where now you have to be able to absorb and anti-rotate and stabilize yourself on a unstable surface, where you can now decrease the amount of limbs you have access to increase the challenge of stability. And all we're doing is increasing or decreasing the amount of stability and support that we have. The less stability and support we have, the more of a challenge it's going to be, right? Here's a perfect example. Stand on one leg. It's going to be more challenging than laying on the ground, right? Because you have the most stability and support, the most surface area contact by laying on the ground versus standing on one leg, more compressive forces through a narrower frame of support, right? It's going to be more joint load off of a smaller surface area versus wider spread. You lay on the ground, you're covering the maximum amount of surface area, which is less compressive forces, the least amount of compressive forces on your body. Simple exercise would be a supine diaphragmatic breathing, right? From there, depending on the level of athleticism, I would probably take them to a 6-month unsupported, ensure that they can cue positioning, because that is going to be a prerequisite to graduating to a higher level. And that is why I would start someone at a supine 3-month. That's usually my starting point, because positioning and posture, if it is a musculoskeletal or a length tension relationship or even a neurological type of issue, supine 3 month is something that is a foundational movement that we acquire at 3 months of life. Why it's called supine 3 months, right? So being able to identify ideal movement cues and postures, which a baby has, right, versus a 35, 45, 65-year-old individual, they're going to have compensatory movement patterns that may have developed over time of a lifetime of non-ideal movement patterns. And it's not their fault, but it's just not really something that's taught at a developmental level, which would be elementary school. So this is just something to consider. We can coach these things, right? So having someone in a supine 3 month position, you're thinking about rib position, pulling the rib cage down, creating lumbar support. You're thinking about lengthening through the cervical. You're thinking about creating a broad chest. You're thinking about belly breathing. You're thinking about relaxing your lower extremity. These are the things that you have to acquire to obtain a true 3 month position. From there, you can progress significantly quick because these are the principles on which all of the other movements are going to be framed upon. Whether it's differentiated, undifferentiated, whether you go to 6 month, whether you go to prone, there are going to be developmental cues and postures and positions that are going to create efficient and optimal joint load, symmetry, balance when it comes to length tension relationship on the kinetic chain, on the fascial system, on the entire structure and system. If I were working with an athlete, I would start them at a supine 3 month. I would obtain all of those objectives of being able to lengthen, being able to internally pressurize, and being able to use the required systems, no more, no less. From there, I would get them into a side supported position to be able to understand upper and lower extremity differentiation as well as scapular stabilization. That's a big one, especially for things like dyskinesia, for winging. Being able to optimally activate the rotator cuff will help with a significant amount of injuries, even at the elite level. Being able to set the scapula, having that scapulohumeral rhythm, being able to keep that medial border of the scapula strengthened via the serratus anterior, being able to pull that shoulder blade, keep it affixed to the rib cage, and move with symmetry. These are characteristics that are of high level, but don't necessarily have to be. But from here, from a supine 3 month, I would go to a sideline position. I'm focusing on cervical elongation. I'm focusing on symmetry in a sideline position. I'm focusing on scapular stability. I'm focusing on sideline internal pressurization through the diaphragm. I'm thinking of the hip as well as the thigh and the knee contact. I'm thinking about all the way down, even to my foot, how I'm contacting the ground. I'm thinking about elongating and pressurizing. These would be things that I would be looking for in a sideline position. From here, I go to a belly down position. I'm focusing on a prone position. I'm focusing on ideal pelvic alignment and congruency. So nothing of an anterior pelvic tilt. I'm thinking of a posterior tilt. The cue here I'd like to use is thinking about tucking your tail between your legs. That is the cue that I use when it comes to that. Then from there, that is essentially stacking your pelvis in alignment over your diaphragm. Unless your diaphragm or your rib cage is flared up in a prone position, you can create a fixed point from your elbow to your forearm to your hand, which helps you draw your rib cage down, right? So if you think about it if you're like in a sphinx position on your elbows on your belly, you're thinking about drawing your elbows down towards your hips. You don't want to actually slide your hands down the ground. You just want to think about creating that draw. You want to think about opening your hands broadly and then lengthening your fingers and clasping the earth and then just keeping that contact through an active hand, right? With not overactive, but just activated enough. This is just creating a base of support and connection. And then from here, you're thinking about contact through the forearm, through that medial elbow, right? Through that medial epicondyle, that inside elbow. And then from there, you're thinking about elongating, right? Pushing the earth away through all of that, gently drawing the elbows down towards your rib cage and towards your hips, right? That's going to help pull and draw that rib cage down. If you have that, and then you're maintaining that pelvic position, now you're thinking about creating that pressurization because now you have that diaphragm stacked over your hips in a prone belly down position. And then from there, you're lengthened through the cervical, thinking about growing through the crown and retracting the neck. And then from here, you're lengthened, you're posturally aligned. And now you want to be able to relax the lower extremity. So turn your glutes off, relax your legs, and create that contact all the way down. And then you're actively and elongated through the upper extremity through the hip. Once you obtain these positions, supine, side lying, prone, from there, I'm going to half kneeling, I'm going to verticalization. And again, this is a more advanced individual. And then from there, I'm basically going to progress them to whatever their movement is, right? So for a surfer, I'm thinking of the ability to rotate, the ability to stabilize through the trunk and absorb, as well as transmit rotational forces, anti-shearing. So there's going to be trunk stabilization is going to be a huge one. Being able to stabilize the scapula because basically you got to push yourself up through an unstable surface, which is the board. And then lower extremity, upper extremity differentiation. So can you disassociate your lower extremity to your upper extremity? So lower hip rotation is going to be a big one, as well as knee, ankle, the kinetic chain, that whole system, the fascial system, right? Which we can create so much more torque through the fascia. The fascia is basically the force transmitter, right? But we also have muscles and structures and systems that contribute. And the more efficient those are, the more effective we are at transmitting forces, loading, absorbing, and compressing, or anti-compressing, which is essentially anti-rotation, anti-compression, anti-shear. So when it comes to moving efficiently, some other exercises that are my go-to, one of them being the 90-90. This is a really good hip opener, lower extremity opener for stiff hips. And then even going into a side support position to focus on diaphragmatic breathing and lengthening. That's another great one. Are crawling patterns, limb differentiated patterns in a gravity dependent position where you have less of a basic support because now you're basically on your hands as well as your knees. You're thinking of a crawling strategy. So you're thinking about anti-rotation as well as oblique sling activation. So multi-segmental limb differentiated patterns would essentially be what this is called. So just to recap in this episode, we've gone over trunk stability, the trunk as a system. We've gone over the various different misconceptions. We've gone over the concept of trunk stabilization. Why understanding things like posture, stabilization are going to be key characteristics to anything that we do in our life. We also talked about the benefits of stabilization when it comes to the different things that we physically require from our body. We've talked about dysfunctions from a lack of proper sequencing, patterning, and the ability to stabilize, as well as what that can contribute to. And we've also talked about some practical strategies that you can integrate at home. Well, I've reached the end of the episode, and if you've listened to it up to this point, I just want to thank you so much for being a supporter of this podcast. This has been quite honestly, 15 years of the making of me saying tomorrow. And I figured that what better time than today to get this going. So these is just, again, a sort of dialogue of my insights, of my perspective of practicing in sports medicine, of studying and dedicating my passions and desires to health, wellness, fitness, and taking care of the body, and having perspective and insight that is practical and realistic. So I hope that this was an episode that was helpful for you. And if you did find this interesting at all, then I'd appreciate if you could leave a review. Also, subscribe and follow on my handles at sheldon.nbt. You can check out my school community, SKOOL, at school.com/movement-based therapy. So thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you on the next one.